The invitation came wrapped in midnight. I found it on my desk one stormy evening, the corners of the parchment curling as if resisting my touch. My study, usually so familiar with its shelves of ancient tomes and the comforting smell of leather and ink, felt foreign under the flickering candlelight. The storm outside rattled the windows, but it was the parchment that held my attention. Its script shimmered faintly, as though written with moonlight itself. Magnus, beneath Yondara's veil lies what we both seek. The chalice awaits us at the Sanctuary of Whispers. Meet me by the solstice moonrise, or lose what is yours by right, A. There was no need to see the signature to know the author. Alaric. The name lingered in the air like a curse. My rival since our days as apprentices, his presence in my life had been an unrelenting shadow, a constant reminder of the heights I had yet to reach, the spells I had yet to master. But this was different. The chalice. If the legends were true, it was no ordinary artifact. Whispers in magical circles spoke of its power to amplify the wielder's abilities, unlocking hidden potential, or unearthing destructive forces better left buried. Alaric's cryptic challenge left little room for interpretation. He wanted the chalice, and he wanted me there to witness his triumph. Or, perhaps, he needed me there for reasons he dared not admit. The storm followed me to Yondara Forest, though its howling seemed muted under the ancient canopy. The towering trees were like sentinels, their moss-laden branches forming a dense, cathedral-like vault above me. Every step seemed to stir the wood's unease. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the faint rustling of leaves carried whispers, too faint to discern, yet too deliberate to ignore. I clutched my staff tighter, its carved runes glowing softly to ward off the encroaching dark. The path to the Sanctuary of Whispers was one I had traveled in the past, but tonight it felt foreign, as though the forest itself had conspired to obscure my way. Ahead, the sanctuary came into view, a half-ruined structure draped in ivy and decay. Its broken spires reached skyward like skeletal fingers. In the center of the main chamber stood a stone pedestal upon which rested the chalice. And Alaric. He was already there, his tall figure silhouetted against the faint glow emanating from the chalice. His pale blue robes, embroidered with intricate sigils, shimmered faintly in the moonlight. As I stepped into the sanctuary, he turned, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "You came," he said, his voice smooth and edged with triumph. "I thought you might lack the courage." "Spare me the theatrics," I replied, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at my core. "What is this? Another of your schemes?" "No scheme," he said, gesturing toward the chalice. "This is an opportunity for both of us." As I stepped closer, I felt the air shift, heavy and charged. The chalice was unlike anything I'd seen, a vessel of blackened silver, its surface adorned with writhing runes that seemed to shift under the faint moonlight. It emitted a low hum, a sound that wasn't quite audible, but resonated in my chest, tugging at the edges of my mind. "Do you hear it?" Alaric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's alive." I did hear it, or rather, I felt it, a faint, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, growing louder with every step closer. The chalice seemed to breathe, its power coiling around the room like a living thing, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. "What do you want, Alaric?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the artifact. "To settle this," he said, his voice suddenly harder. "Once and for all, the chalice chooses only one. Let it decide who among us is worthy." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about power, it was about pride, about a rivalry that had festered for years. And yet, as much as I hated to admit it, the chalice's pull was undeniable. I wanted it, needed it. If I walked away, I would forever wonder what might have been. The The whispers grew louder as we approached the pedestal together. The chalice seemed to sense our proximity, its hum deepening into a sound that was almost a voice, low and unintelligible, yet full of intent. And then it spoke. The chalice's voice was not a sound, but a presence. It seeped into my thoughts, a slow, insidious tide of words that weren't words, pulling at the corners of my sanity. My vision blurred, the world around me fading until there was only the chalice, its shifting runes glowing with a sinister light. Drink, choose, become. The words formed in my mind, not in Alaric's voice, nor mine, but something older, colder. I glanced at Alaric, and from the tightening of his jaw, I knew he heard it too. "What did you bring us to?" I demanded, though my voice wavered. Alaric's hand trembled as he reached toward the chalice, stopping just short of its rim. "Do you feel it, Magnus? The power? It's calling us. Together we could—" "No," I interrupted, stepping closer. "Together we destroy ourselves." Even as I said it, the chalice's whispers grew louder, needling at my thoughts, dredging up my insecurities. Images flashed through my mind, my failures, my ambitions unfulfilled. And always, Alaric standing over me, victorious. The sanctuary began to shift around us, the shadows deepening as the chalice's power pulsed. I saw the runes on the walls writhe, as though the ancient stones themselves were reacting to its presence. A faint, glowing mist seeped from the chalice, coiling toward us like ghostly tendrils. "We should leave," I said, but my voice was a whisper, swallowed by the growing tension. "You can leave," Alaric said, his eyes fixed on the chalice. "But I won't, not until I take what's mine." As I watched, the mist wrapped around him, seeping into his skin. His eyes widened, and for a moment I saw something flash in them, fear, or perhaps recognition. But it was too late. The chalice had already begun its work. The chalice's mist thickened, weaving itself around Alaric like threads of gossamer light, yet its presence felt far from delicate. It pulsed with power, a rhythmic thrum that matched the pounding in my chest. Alaric's form wavered, his sharp silhouette seeming to blur and stretch as though he were being unraveled and rewoven by an unseen hand. I stepped back instinctively, my staff glowing faintly in response to the oppressive force that filled the sanctuary. The air was charged, heavy with a presence that was not entirely of this world. The chalice, now glowing brighter than before, seemed to shudder, its blackened silver surface writhing like liquid mercury. The runes etched upon it shifted, their once indecipherable script aligning into words I could almost read. "You shouldn't have touched it," I said, though my voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the growing hum. Alaric turned to me, his eyes wide, his face pale. It's speaking to me, Magnus. It's offering us everything we've ever wanted." His voice was strained, as though he were struggling to contain the emotions threatening to consume him. "Power, knowledge, recognition. It's lying," I said firmly, gripping my staff tighter. "No magic like this comes without a price." Before I could take another step, the mist swirled outward, coiling through the room like an animate thing. It slithered up the walls, tracing the ancient carvings etched into the sanctuary's stones, and the runes came alive, glowing faintly with an eerie green light. The whispers returned, louder and clearer now, though still fragmented. I caught snippets of words, disjointed and chilling. Release, bind, forever. The chalice pulsed, and the sanctuary groaned. The carvings on the walls shifted like restless shadows, as if the very structure of the building was reacting to the artifact's presence. Then, the mist began to take shape. Figures emerged, tall, ethereal forms with indistinct features, their bodies composed of the same glowing mist. They moved slowly, deliberately, their heads tilting as though observing us. Their presence sent a cold dread skittering down my spine. "They're the keepers," Alaric whispered, his voice laced with awe and fear. "Guardians of the chalice." "They're not here to guard it," I said, backing away as one of the figures drew closer. Its featureless face turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me, laying bare my deepest thoughts and fears. "They're here to bind us to it." The air grew colder as the figures advanced. Their movements were graceful, but unnervingly precise, as though following a pattern we couldn't perceive. One reached for Alaric, its misty hand hovering just above his chest. "No!" I shouted, raising my staff. A burst of light erupted from its tip, casting sharp shadows across the room. The figure recoiled, its form dissipating briefly before reforming. The others turned their attention to me, their movements synchronizing as if sharing a singular purpose. Alaric stumbled back, the spell over him momentarily broken. "What do we do?" he asked, panic seeping into his voice. "We have to leave," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The sanctuary seemed alive now, its walls pulsing faintly with the same rhythm as the chalice. The air itself resisted our movements, thick and heavy, like wading through water. The chalice's whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of commands and pleas. Stay. Choose. Become. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally as we fought against the sanctuary's pull. The mist swirled around us in tightening spirals, its luminescent tendrils weaving a barrier that felt more psychological than physical. Every step forward was met with resistance, not just from the mist, but from within. Doubt, fear, and the chalice's insidious promises gnawed at my resolve. "Magnus!" Alaric called, his voice echoing faintly, as though we were separated by more than distance. I turned to see him struggling against the mist, his face pale and strained. "We can't fight it. We need to work together." I hesitated. Trusting Alaric was a bitter pill to swallow, but the alternative was unthinkable. Whatever the chalice wanted, we couldn't let it win. "Fine," I said, meeting his gaze. "But don't make me regret this." We approached the chalice together, its glow casting long, shifting shadows across the sanctuary. The ethereal figures seemed to pause, their heads tilting as though assessing our intentions. The whispers quieted, replaced by a low, resonant hum that vibrated in my bones. "Focus on the runes," I said, gesturing to the carvings on the walls. "They're the key. If we can disrupt their alignment, we might weaken the chalice's hold." Alaric nodded, his hands trembling as he raised his own staff. Together, we channeled our energy into the sanctuary, targeting the glowing runes. Threads of light shot forth, weaving a counterspell designed to unravel the enchantment binding the room. At first, it seemed to work. The mist began to thin, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted slightly. But then, the chalice flared with blinding light, its whispers rising into a deafening roar. The sanctuary trembled, and the runes on the walls shifted violently, rearranging themselves into new patterns. "It's adapting," Alaric shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Keep going," I urged, pouring every ounce of energy into the counterspell. My vision blurred, and I felt the pull of the chalice intensify, its whispers wrapping around my thoughts like chains. "You cannot win," the voice hissed, clear and piercing. "You are already mine." The figures surged forward, their forms solidifying as they reached for us. Their touch was icy, draining, and I felt my strength falter. "Magnus!" Alaric's voice cut through the chaos. "We have to sever the connection, destroy the link between us and the chalice." "How?" I demanded, but even as I spoke, the answer formed in my mind. The chalice wasn't just a tool. It was a conduit, amplifying the worst of us, feeding on our rivalry. "We break the bond," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. No more rivalry, no more hatred. We let it go. Alaric's eyes widened, but he nodded. Together, we spoke the words, a binding spell of unity, rejecting the chalice's power. The sanctuary shuddered violently, the mist collapsing inward. The chalice's glow dimmed, and the whispers fell silent. For a moment, there was only stillness, a fragile, breathless pause before the world snapped back into place. The chalice remained, but its power was diminished, its presence subdued. The sanctuary, once alive with malevolence, now felt hollow, like a shell stripped of its essence. "We did it," Alaric said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as we turned to leave, the faintest whisper echoed in the distance. "For now." The sanctuary was silent, but the kind of silence that felt alive, pregnant with unseen eyes and ears. The chalice still sat upon its pedestal, no longer glowing, but its presence remained oppressive, like a weight that pressed on the edges of reality. I could feel it watching us, even as it lay inert, its runes now dark and motionless. Alaric and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke as we turned toward the exit, the sanctuary's oppressive air clinging to us like mist. The path back through Yondara Forest felt longer, the trees more menacing in their towering stillness. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, flickering like firelight, though there was no flame. "Do you feel it?" Alaric finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "It's not over." The forest exhaled around us, the faint rustling of leaves carrying the remnants of a sound I couldn't place. A whisper, a sigh. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, skittering through the air like a secret shared among the trees. As we walked, the trail shifted beneath our feet, the dirt soft and yielding, as though it were tired of holding our weight. My staff glowed faintly, but its light felt muted, swallowed by the deepening gloom. "Magnus," Alaric said, stopping abruptly. His face was pale, his eyes locked on something behind me. "Don't turn around." The words chilled me to the bone. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. But the compulsion to look was overwhelming, like an itch in the mind that begged to be scratched. Slowly, against my better judgment, I turned. The mist was there. It hovered just beyond the trees, faint and amorphous, but unmistakably alive. Tendrils of pale light curled lazily through the air, their movements deliberate and almost playful. As I stared, I saw them begin to coalesce, forming the faint outlines of figures, tall and slender, their heads tilting unnaturally as if studying us. "They followed us," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No," Alaric replied, gripping his staff tightly. "They never left." The figures didn't move closer, but their presence was oppressive, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a windless room. The whispering began again, soft and insidious, threading its way into my thoughts. "The chalice is eternal. It waits, it watches, it learns." "Don't listen to them," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to Alaric or myself. We pushed forward, the path narrowing as the trees pressed closer together. The air grew colder, and frost began to creep across the ground, crackling softly under our steps. I could feel the sanctuary's lingering touch, as though the chalice's whispers had left a stain on reality that couldn't be scrubbed away. Finally, we broke free of the forest's grasp. The world opened before us, the faint glow of the city's magical wards visible on the horizon. But even as we stepped into the open, the oppressive weight remained, a reminder that the chalice's reach extended far beyond the sanctuary. "We should tell the council," Alaric said, though his voice lacked conviction. "And what would we tell them?" I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. that we found a cursed artifact and barely escaped with our minds intact, that the chalice whispered promises of power and tried to consume us. He didn't answer, and I couldn't blame him. The Magical Council, for all its authority, thrived on secrets and control. If they learned of the chalice, they would claim it for themselves, or worse, unleash its curse upon the world in their pursuit of knowledge. The city's lights grew closer, but the unease didn't fade. The forest behind us felt alive, its shadows stretching toward us as if unwilling to let us go. I glanced at Alaric, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a glint of the same ambition that had driven him to seek the chalice in the first place. "We can't go back to the way things were," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "No," I agreed, though the words tasted bitter. "We can't." As we parted ways at the edge of the city, I felt the weight of the chalice's whispers still clinging to my thoughts. Its promises, its threats, its insidious pull, they would not be silenced so easily. The chalice might have been left behind, but its echo lingered, a constant reminder of the power it offered and the price it demanded. That night, as I lay in my bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in my room seemed deeper, their shapes shifting just beyond the edge of perception. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I thought I heard a whisper. "Someday, you will return." The chalice's voice had diminished, but its presence remained, a specter haunting not just my mind, but the fabric of the magical world itself. It wasn't over, not truly.